Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's book-to-show comparison for The Expanse, Season 1, Episode 6, Rock Bottom. This video is a part of a series of videos where I compare episodes of The Expanse TV series to that of its source material, pointing out the differences and giving my opinion on whether or not I believe the adaptation works. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for The Expanse up to the end of Season 1. However, I will not spoil events that have occurred in the books that have yet to occur in the show. So if you haven't read the books, don't worry, this will be free from spoilers provided you have seen up to the end of Season 1. So the episode begins with a scene of Avasarala consulting with the head of a private company with access to spies that he uses for corporate espionage. But Avasarala wants to borrow this spy in order to spy on Fred Johnson for her own purposes. When the businessman in question refuses, she blackmails him with the fact that his son is in prison and is up for parole, and offers to set him free if he helps, and of course to deny his parole if he doesn't help. And so he acquiesces. Now, this continues to be an example of Avasarala's Season 1 storyline being completely show original, as none of this happened in the books. It's plausible that Earth was using spies to spy on Fred Johnson, but it was never stated. Further, this feeds into an overarching storyline in the show that didn't exist in the books, but as always with Avasarala, I think this adds a lot of flavor to the overarching political situation that makes it seem more real, and that Earth is actively involved in what's going on with James Holden, which wasn't in the book, so +2. So next we go to the Rocinante arriving at Tycho Station. Holden and Amos confront Fred Johnson, where there's a standoff of sorts as Johnson wants them to come on board to testify to what they said, to what they saw, but is adamant that they need to relinquish their weapons and surrender, and further, that the Rocinante now belongs to him. So a standoff ensues, where they're all pointing guns at each other, and Johnson's men try to board the Rocinante, but Naomi and Alex get the upper hand and ambush his men, and thus Johnson is the one who surrenders. Now, in the novels, Holden's first meeting with Fred Johnson is a lot more amicable. Although there is an undercurrent of there being a sort of disagreement and trouble ahead, and Johnson wanting to take the Rocinante, but it's more of just an undercurrent. It's not nearly as on the surface as it is here. In the novels, all 4 members of the Rocinante board Tycho and meet with Johnson, who is in fact extremely friendly and offers to pay for their vacation and pay for all their food and hotels and stuff like that. The issue comes in when Holden and the others realize that there must be a catch, and that the catch is that they have to testify, but at first they go along with this. Johnson never threatens to take the Rocinante by force. In fact, later Johnson asks Holden if he can use the Rocinante, and although at that stage Holden threatens a standoff if Johnson tries to take the Rocinante by force, he never actually tries, and they come to an agreement instead. Overall, I thought this was just an unnecessary way to add tension to the episode so the episode could have more suspense, but I don't think it was entirely necessary, and its inclusion felt a bit forced, so I'll give this a -1. So then we cut over to series where we continue on the storyline with Miller being abducted by Dawes, who then proceeds to interrogate Miller about what he found in the data broker's place. Dawes has his goons rough him up and asks him questions about what he knows about Julie Mao. Miller actually did find the data chip at the broker's place, which he has hidden in his hat, but Dawes doesn't find it. Instead, Dawes deduces that Miller is in love with Mal, and that's why he won't let this go. So, absolutely, positively, nothing even remotely like this happens in the books. They completely go off page here. And as I'll get into a bit more shortly later on, with Dawes in the books is nothing like this. This whole storyline with the data broker is made up, and Miller never gets abducted. Plus, Miller's feelings for Mal was handled a lot more subtly in the books. The way Dawes outright spells it out here is kind of treating the audience like idiots, and overall this whole thing is unnecessary, so -3. So then we cut back to Tycho Station, where Holden meets with Fred Johnson, who tells him about a mission that he needs a Martian gunship for, and that is to retrieve an operative whom he only knows by his code name Lionel Polanski, who is the lone survivor of the Scopuli, the ship that was used as bait to attract the Canterbury. Holden refuses to hand over his ship, but says that he'll go get the operative himself. Johnson at first refuses because he says he needs him as a witness. Holden then says that the others will stay behind as witnesses and mentions that they're still in a standoff, so suggests this is a compromise, so Johnson agrees. Now, this is somewhat similar to what went down in the novel, says there Johnson did ask Holden for the Rocinante to retrieve Lionel Polanski, and Holden refused, saying that he could go, but Johnson wasn't happy because he wanted them as witnesses. So the difference is, rather than being contacted by an operative named Lionel Polanski, in the novels, Lionel Polanski was a fake name made up by Johnson, used for official documents and such. In other words, it was a name that existed only on paper and not a real person, and that name was used to book accommodation on Eros. And Johnson assumed it must be tied with what went down in the Scopuli, but didn't outright state it like he did here. And in the novels, Holden never offers for his crewmates to stay behind, because in the novels this scene actually takes place 5 or so days after they've been on Tycho for a while relaxing. In the show, this scene takes place immediately after they arrive, and then they relax. But in novels, the Rocinante crew is under the impression that they're just going to be waiting around to be witnesses, and they'll be waiting around for like months until this actually happens, and so this meeting signals the end of their shore leave, as the plan all along was for the entire crew to go. Also in the show, it's presented as a compromise to a standoff, whereas in the novels, Johnson actually officially hires the Rocinante to work for him. So, not huge differences, but I kind of like it better how they're waiting along for what could possibly be months until they strike a deal to go out and find work, so I'll give this a -1. So then we get a scene of Holden telling the others on his crew about the plan and how Fred is going to give him a crew and the others will stay behind to testify. When they grill him on why he wants to go so badly, he confesses to being the one who logged the distress call that got the Canterbury destroyed. Amos is pissed off, but Naomi confesses to also knowing, to which Amos is a bit hurt by, and Alex is notably upset. Now, as I said in the novels, it was never a factor that Naomi and the others would stay behind. It was always Holden's plan to take everyone with them. I can kind of see why they made the changes, because it's a bit, it's like a cathartic moment when the crew all got back together, although it did feel a bit telegraphed and unnecessary. Although, as I mentioned in previous videos, the whole storyline with Holden logging the distress call didn't exist in the books, and it didn't seem to have that big of an impact here, so ultimately feels unnecessary, so -1. So we cut back to series where Dawes continues to interrogate Miller, and Miller is abstinent and fights back by insulting him with the story that he murdered his own sister. Dawes clarified that she was suffering from an illness that she never recovered from, and their family was poor, and having her around threatened the lives of him and his brothers and sisters, as his family was too poor to take care of them all. So it was kind of a heartfelt story that spoke to his character and unnecessary evils that Belters have to go through. But Miller describes it as Dawes being a man who's like power hungry, where everyone else dies except for him. So again, absolutely nothing like this in the books. No story even similar to this. And as I talked about in previous videos, Dawes is almost a completely different character in the books, as he's more of a diplomat and he's more like political. He's not a madman with power and like an ambitious terrorist leader that Dawes in the show is. In fact, show Dawes more resembles a character who is in books 5 and 6, which makes me wonder, when the show gets to that material, if they will simply have Dawes play that part. Or possibly he could play the part of a character who's more prominent in book 7. I don't know, but I think there's a reason they changed Doll's character so drastically. And as I said, they might as well just given this character a different name at this point. But I actually like the richness that this backstory gives his character, and I think this scene does do a good job at showing us who this version of Dolls is. So I'll give this a +1. So I might as well go ahead and talk about this storyline with these rockhopper belters getting harassed by Martians. And I'll talk about all of this in one go instead of going scene by scene, as these scenes depict a boy and his uncle, out collecting rocks for a living, and they're getting harassed by the Martian military, and when they dare to speak out, the Martians cut off their access to the shipping lanes, which essentially is a death sentence, but they don't care. So the uncle goes crazy, shoves the nephew out the airlock with the suit, and then goes on a suicide run towards the Martian ship, which only results in his ship getting destroyed. So first off, nothing like this in the books whatsoever, and those who saw my initial review for this episode will know I never liked these scenes to begin with. Even before I read the books, they felt irrelevant to the main story and a big waste of time, and after having read the books, I still feel that way. In fact, I wasn't the least bit surprised to learn that these scenes were not in the books. Now, I didn't recognize him at the time, but the nephew character was the same character who tried to steal water on Sirius in an earlier episode where Miller told him, "Stay away from the aqua," and he will later appear in several episodes in season 2. This character does not exist in the books, or at least only existed for those few scenes that are in season 2. So all this was a construct of the show, and in my opinion, entirely unnecessary one. Understand the intention of including these scenes. It's meant to demonstrate the hostility between Mars and the Belt after the destruction of the Dollinger, which was explored a lot more clearly in the books, and also how Belters are being oppressed by the Inners. But frankly, I think that point has been hammered in again and again and again throughout season 1, and by the time we get these scenes, it's kind of like beating a dead horse. Yes, we get it. The Belt is oppressed by the inner planets. That was made crystal clear in the pilot episode itself, not to mention all the subsequent episodes after, spending an entire storyline on an irrelevant side plot to hammer in what we already know is completely unacceptable and a waste of time. And this character isn't that important enough for all this setup. So for repeating the same story beats over and over again with an entire storyline that took up way more time than it should have, I'll give this a -5. For doing such a horrible job at transcribing the tension that existed between Mars and the Belt, which was handled far more better in the books, I'll give this another -5. And for spending so much time to set up this useless side character that nobody cares about, I'll give this another -5. So then we go back to Earth, where Aaron Wright dresses down Avasarala for blackmailing the business leader, and overall he doesn't seem interested in Avasarala looking into what Fred Johnson is doing. We later learn this is because Aaron Wright is working for Protogen, or working with them, and probably doesn't want her finding out more than she should. However, here Avasarala is indicating that Fred Johnson is responsible for the attacks, which Aaron Wright knows isn't the case, which is perhaps why he lets her proceed, as at this stage she's still, letting her hatred towards the OPA drive her. So, as with all the Avasarala, none of this in the books, and her whole hawkish attitude towards the OPA is an invention of the show. But as I said, I think the scenes like this one added a lot of flavor to the story, particularly when involving Aaron Wright, so I'll give this a +3. So we cut back to Taco Station to a scene of Alex and Amos hanging out at a bar where a male prostitute approaches Amos, but he makes it very clear that he's not interested, but he does give him a heads up on another potential customer who is packing a knife and sort of warns him. Alex jokes about him being his union rep, but Amos simply states that he grew up in places like this and understood this kind of life. So he just wanted to look out for him. Now, when I first saw this episode, I assumed this meant Amos used to be a prostitute, but watching the scene again, that's not necessarily the case, as all he said is he grew up in places like this. In the novels, he wasn't a prostitute, but he did grow up with a criminal lifestyle, so that would be consistent. When Amos suggested Alex gets himself some companionship, Alex points to his wedding ring, but Amos states matter-of-factly that he isn't married, which Alex confirms, saying that he used to be. This is also consistent with the novels, as he has an ex-wife at this stage, although I do believe earlier in the season, in fact later in this episode, they show him with a picture of a woman and a young boy, implying that he has a son, but in the novels he doesn't have a son, but that's not specifically stated. And no scene like this specifically exists in the novels, but it did indicate that Alex, and especially Amos, did go out drinking a lot when they were on Tycho Station. So ultimately this is fine, I'll give it a 0. So then we get a scene on the Rocinante as Johnson's people prepare the ship. Johnson explains to Holden that they are, changing the ship to look like a gas freighter, but in the novels this was actually Holden's idea, but whatever. Anyway, Naomi is really protective about the ship in a way that she wasn't in the novels, as their relationship with Johnson wasn't as hostile. Holden then convinces her to go get a drink with him and jokes that they'll charge it to Fred's tab, implying that they don't have his permission to do so, which frankly I don't see how they could do it without his permission. In the novels, Fred offers to pay for everything, but I could see why this, with the atmosphere of hostility in the show, he wouldn't do that. Either way, these changes are fine, so I'll give it a 0. So we then cut back to series where Dawes' thugs attempt to kill Miller by throwing him out an airlock, but Muss shows up at the last second, kills the thugs, and saves Miller. Now again, nothing even remotely like this occurs in the books. In fact, the whole scene felt really tacked on and out of place. Even before I read the novels, I still didn't really have a firm grasp on who Muss was and what her relationship to Miller was. It seemed rather convenient for her to just show up just at the right time to save Miller's life, so I'll give this a -3. So we go back to Tycho to see Holden and Naomi drinking, and this is similar to a scene in the novels where Naomi sings karaoke and then grabs a drink with Holden afterwards, as in both cases they bond over drinks, kind of foreshadowing their relationship to come. However, the conversation here is a bit more serious as they salute the fallen, but it serves the same overall function, so I'll give it a 0. However, during these scenes we get some visuals of Fred Johnson, whom Holden had asked to take care of the body of Lieutenant Lopez, and Johnson finds a data chip on Lopez. However, in the novels, Holden found the data chip on him shortly after Lopez died, and in fact he gave it to Johnson because he knew Johnson would have more resources to find out what was on the data chip. But ultimately, Holden used it as a bargaining chip so Johnson would allow him to take the Rocinante out. And it's part of the reason why Johnson agreed to do so. But both ways work for the respective mediums, so I'll give this a 0. So back on the series, we get a scene of Muss treating Miller after his near death, and Miller comforting Muss how she deals with the trauma of having just killed people for the first time. Miller then reveals that he has the data chip from the broker hidden in his hat, and they go to play it to find out what is on it. Again, absolutely nothing like this in the books. I'm kind of fine with the data chip part, but the Muss and Miller stuff was pointless and a bit of wasted time, so I'll give it a -1. So we go back to Rocinante, where Holden boards to get going on his mission, and what a shocker, Naomi and Alex are there to be his crew, and he's told that Amos will be along shortly as well. I'm shocked. As I said in the books, it was the crew's plan to go with Holden all along, so I'm a bit annoyed by this because it's a bit telegraphed to do it this way. But then again, the crew dynamics in the show are a bit different. There was more tension between them, so it's kind of touching to see them come together like this, so I'll give it a 0. Then Fred Johnson comes to see them off, and Alex explains that they don't need to be there to testify because they gave their dispositions. Whereas in the books, I think it was their plan to return to testify after they were finished, but whatever. So Naomi then goes to Johnson and asks him to find someone for her as payment for what they're doing. This is interesting, as this wasn't in the books, but it could refer to a storyline about Naomi's backstory that's explored more in books 5 and 6, so I won't get into it here, but just to say that this is the second time I noticed in the first season them foreshadowing this particular storyline with her. It makes me wonder if they'll get to it earlier in the show, or maybe it's just the fact that the scripts for season 1 was being written at the same time as book 5 was being written, so maybe that had some influence on that. Either way, I find this interesting, so I'll give it a +1. We didn't find out where Amos is, as we get a shot of him painting a Rocinante logo on the side of the ship. I'm not sure how practical this is for a spaceship, but I think it has more to do with symbolism. Anyway, this doesn't happen in the books, but I think it's a nice touch because it shows that even Amos considers them a full crew now, and it sort of solidifies this ragtag group of wanderers as a full crew. Made me smile, so I'll give it a +2. So next we go back to Ceres to get a scene of Miller taking the data chip he has to his chief, Shadig. So the data chip has a video of someone on Phoebe station talking about how there's something there of great resources, something that could change the balance of power. So Miller lays it all out for her that Julie Mel bought the recording from the data broker, that something was going on Phoebe, and she gave that recording to Dawes, who sent her on the Scopuli to investigate, and when the Scopuli went missing, Dawes tried to distance himself from it so as not to look guilty. Shadig immediately asks Miller if he has another copy, and when he says no, she locks it away in a safe and then immediately rescinds all of Miller's clearance and access and tells him he's fired. He then deduces that she's on Dawes' payroll and she has him thrown out of her office. Now, this went down very differently in the books. This scene is actually based off of 2 separate scenes from the novels. In the first scene, Shadig calls Miller into her office and Dawes is there. So in the novel, she doesn't try to hide her connection to Dawes. In fact, in the meeting, she outright defers to him as the man in charge. However, in this case, Miller has no evidence. He was simply trying to contact Julie Mel's parents for more information. So Dawes, instead of capturing and torturing him or whatever, he simply lays it all out for Miller exactly what's going on. And in this case, Dawes genuinely wants to know what happened to Julie in the Scopuli rather than trying to cover it up, or at least that's what he claims, but I believe him myself. In fact, it's at this time he reveals that the OPA has Holden, meaning that he's working directly with Fred Johnson, something that clearly isn't the case in the show. He then tells Miller that Miller simply isn't good enough to work on this case. He's a has-been drunk, and he would just interfere with their investigation. Plus, he doesn't have the jurisdiction that the OPA has. So Shadig orders him to drop the case. But she doesn't fire him. Instead, assigns him riot patrol and to investigate other murders that aren't important. So a few days or weeks later, Star Helix officially pulls out from Ceres, meaning Earth abandons Ceres, and Ceres officially is claimed by the OPA with Dawes as its governor. Also at this stage, the OPA is currently engaged in a war with Mars. None of this happens in the show. So once this happens, Shadig calls Miller under this new leadership and says that things are really dangerous and she doesn't trust a drunk like Miller, so she fires him. Phoebe is never mentioned and in fact doesn't even come up in the books until much later, and at this stage Miller hasn't figured out the case, and it is in fact he has very little to go on. I'm not quite sure which version I like better. They both have their pros and cons, but I might go with the show on this one because it was a little more exciting than simply 3 people sitting down to have a conversation. Now, I remember finding the scene where Shadig fires Miller when he discovers something to be quite shocking, so I'll give this a +2. So then we finish off with the scene of the Rocinante ready to head out, where Naomi apologizes to Amos and Holden hands Amos a coffee, who nods in appreciation, making it clear things are all good between them now, and Holden smiles as they are finally behaving like a crew as Alex sets the Rocinante out for a new adventure. Now, this scene wasn't in the books because it didn't need to be, because the crew had already gotten along at this stage, but here in the show they've been constantly bickering at each other and fighting, so it was great to get to see them working together as a crew and to see Amos forgive Holden for logging the distress call and Naomi for lying about it. So, unnecessary scene, I'll give it a +2. So my final adaptation score for Rock Bottom is a -12. Probably the lowest score I've handed out yet, and frankly I think this may in fact be my least favorite episode of The Expanse. It's not altogether bad, as some of the Rocinante crew bonding was interesting, and the scene where Shadig fires Miller was great, but all the stuff with Dawes interrogating Miller was kind of pointless, and I absolutely hated the scenes with the Rockhoppers getting harassed. I could not think of scenes that were more irrelevant and unnecessary to the main plot, as it's just hitting us over the head over and over and over again with things that we already know. It adds nothing to the story, nor the characters, nor anything more to world building than we already know. So, barring a few scenes, this was mostly just a filler episode. So that's it for my book-to-show comparison for The Expanse Season 1, Episode 6. I'll be back in about a month's time with my book-to-show comparison for Episode 7. In the meantime, you can check out my channel as I cover many other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.